And welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. I am your host Tyrant, where we take things from movies, TV shows, pop culture, try to create them in the real world, and test them one-to-one from the media that they come from. Now in today's episode, we are going to be taking a look at lightsabers. May the 4th be with you, yes. Hopefully this goes out on time, and it goes out actually on May the 4th. Anyway, today we're going to be testing lightsabers, real lightsabers. When I say real lightsabers, I don't mean lightsabers from the movies that can cut through anything. I mean real lightsabers from the real world. These here are some of my sabers. Now we are going to be putting these through their tests in a very specific way, and that is in the specific context of self-defense. How would a real lightsaber, one of these sabers, actually fare in a self-defense situation? Now you're probably wondering why it even matters. Why would I even test something like this for the specific purpose of self-defense? Just use a gun or blah blah blah, whatever else. Well, this isn't the US, and a lot of countries around the world have very strict self-defense laws, like mine, and carrying something even like a stick, for example, for the purposes of self-defense, doesn't fly. So yeah, and also this thing looks very ominous, honestly. So I thought for today's episode, why not just give these things a little bit of a test? I've never actually tested a proper lightsaber blade. I've used them in something like a dueling capacity, but I've never actually just used them, as a defense. How much could they protect you in a last-ditch effort? So that's what I'm going to be trying to answer in today's episode. So I'm going to be using one of my lightsaber blades. Now I'm going to be using one of my most high quality and premium blades because they have the most thickest polycarbonate tube, because that's what a lightsaber blade is for the most part. These things are just polycarbonate tubes, so how much do they hold up specifically to defend you? Before we test any of the lightsaber blades, we should go over some of the basics of the blades. First up, lightsaber blades can come in lots of different lengths, thicknesses, and more importantly, diameters. This here is a 7/8 blade. Now this one is a little bit thin, both in my personal taste and for testing purposes. So this blade here has about a 1-inch diameter, it's about 80 centimeters long, and has a very thick wall diameter. So this one is very robust and hopefully will give us the best chances of success in all the testing. Now, if you want to check out some more Star Wars content, I actually have a whole host of lightsaber builds on my second channel, things like crystal reveals, cutaways, and even just standard lightsaber builds. You can check out any of those if you want. I'll leave a full playlist. I've made so many sabers in my time, it's crazy. But with that out of the way, let's get started with today's episode. So before we get into testing, I just wanted to make it perfectly clear. We're not actually testing whether the saber is a good weapon in general. We are just testing how effective it could be in a self-defense situation. I also wanted to make it clear that the construction method of the saber that I am using is a very general and standardized construction method for sabers. It's just held in with a couple of grub screws. So the blade that I bought online is just a very generic, stock standard, thick polycarbonate tube blade. Then the hilt that I'm using is just an aluminum hilt, and I'm using simply grub screws to hold the blade in. So to start off the testing, I decided to go with a pumpkin, just because I was simply curious whether or not it would be able to get through it. Now on my first hit, it didn't do much of anything, but it did crack the pumpkin. It didn't break it in half or anything like that. It simply cracked it. I don't know if I got any good shots of that. And then on the second strike, it left a rather large impression. Then after this, I decided to go up to the melon, and it absolutely obliterated it, as is pretty much expected. A melon is a, relatively speaking, soft fruit. Then the next test subject was, well, me. I decided to see how much it would hurt for me to hit myself. I originally planned to have a friend help me with this one and let them just hit me as hard as they could and maybe test full non-compliance, but sadly I had to do this episode myself, so I had to test on myself, which isn't optimal and doesn't really give a good example of how hard these things can hit on, a person. It's the best I could do given the circumstances. In terms of the pain threshold, I would say it was maybe like a 3 out of 10. It hurt, but for the most part, it would not stop someone in a situation where adrenaline is pumping. Maybe if there was a lot more of those hits, but definitely 1 is not enough to stop anybody. So for a point of comparison, I decided to use a steel prototype that I created and go through some of the same mediums. On the pumpkin, it absolutely obliterated it, and it destroyed pretty much everything else except for the brick. Now this is important for later. So after using the steel prototype version, it did become very apparent how light the saber was in comparison, which is a pretty good virtue because it means you can actually move the blade a whole lot faster while sacrificing obviously power and strength and all these other things. However, the saber blade does still pack a pretty decent punch. This is when I decided to test the blade to failure to see if I could get it to break, so I repeatedly hit Tony as hard as I could over and over again. Until I did get a failure, however, I should note, nothing actually broke. It was simply that the grub screws let go of the blade, so put the blade back in and retighten it, and it's good to go again. Nothing was actually broken. Something that I did notice that was kind of tricky to do was actually follow through on strikes. Now, a lightsaber blade is made out of polycarbonate tubing, and I was hitting Tony, who is a rather bouncy target for the most part. So when I was trying to follow through on strikes, the blades were getting a little bit of a ricochet and bouncing backwards, which I did kind of find interesting because once you timed them, you could actually use the momentum of that ricochet to follow into another strike. So this is when I decided to test it on myself, and I had good reason. I'm not a glutton for punishment. So I decided to test it on my sleeve again because I have Gambison armor on, which is very thick and protects me from these sorts of things, and one on my leg where I was just wearing some normal pants. And the pain difference was quite noticeable. Also, I may have hit a tender part on my leg. So that is also something to mention. Someone wearing regular clothes and not Gambison armor, you're probably going to get far more effective results. So this is where I decided I was going to try and break the saber blade. Now remember back to the steel prototype version, even it couldn't get through the brick, so the polycarbonate tubing had no chance. However, to my surprise, it didn't actually break. It held up for the most part. It flexed quite a lot, but it didn't break. Obviously the brick didn't break either, but the blade didn't break. So yeah. Interesting results there. Even when I was trying to break it, I had a little bit of a hard time. So here are the results from testing. Now, for the most part, this thing held up surprisingly well, especially for what it is. It's just a polycarbonate tube at the end of the day. Now, we have a big dent here from one of the brick strikes, and we have a whole bunch of paint that has come off Tony. But for the most part, this thing is still solid and can still be used. Now, today's episode is important for one specific reason. In a lot of places around the world, carrying anything for the purposes of self-defense can be illegal, but something like this can be carried in most places. Nobody's going to bat an eye, and in a pinch it can defend you. Now, would I say that it hits the hardest? No. Is it a proper weapon? No. However, in a pinch it will hold up rather well for the most part, especially if you've got a quality blade. Now, I don't think that this thing could put someone down with one single strike. However, because it's very durable, well, you can just keep going, I guess. But for the most part, it held up remarkably well, and in a pinch, I do think it would be much better than just using your bare hands. But that is going to be all for today's episode. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below what you thought of today's episode. May the 4th be with you, and as always, I'll see you in another episode. Have a good one, guys.